Good morning, everyone. My name is Machado. I'm the National Practice Lead of the Health and Safety Division at Aon Australia, and welcome to today's session on strategies for managing mental health, which is the second of a number of webinars that we're running on mental health. The first one was in September. Joining me this morning is Dr. Peter Baldwin and Michael Bunting. Dr. Peter Baldwin is joining us from Black Dog Institute. He's a clinical psychologist, has a wealth of experience with regards to a range of things, but today he's talking to us about CBT, or cognitive behaviour therapy. And Michael Bunting is also joining us, and for those who don't know Michael is a leadership and mindfulness specialist. He's done a whole range of things over the years, and he's the owner of WorkSmart, which is a consulting business on leadership, and he's written a number of books on both leadership and mindfulness, and he's also the founder of the Awakened Mind. So please join me in welcoming our guest speakers. Just to set the scene, for those who did sit in on our earlier session in September, we spoke about strategies, mental health strategies that employers should be thinking about at an organisation level. We also spoke around a number of self-care strategies that people should be thinking about or should be exercising, including socialising, getting in touch with people, walking, exercise in itself. But the challenge for us all is, once you've exhausted those options, what else is there that individuals can be thinking about if they're experiencing symptoms of mental health, anxiety, depression, low moods, etc. So today's session has really been designed around, what else is there that we should be thinking about? And cognitive behaviour therapy and mindfulness are both well-proven, research-based techniques that we should all be thinking about. So of course we won't have a lot of time today to cover all of it. So today's really an introduction into both of these topics. So from a cognitive behaviour therapy, Peter, tell us a bit more about CBT.
I love talking about CBT, so that's what I'm going to bore you all with for the next sort of 10-15 minutes. And I thought, I'd start with talking about what CBT is and what CBT isn't, because CBT hasn't had the greatest marketing team over the years, and I think there's some confusion about what we actually do as cognitive behavioural therapists. So let's chat about that first. My slides will work. I can chat about that. Perfect. Here we go. So it's not positive thinking. No one's asking you to think positive all the time. That's ridiculous. It's not how your mind works. Anyway, you can't just think positive, particularly when things are really difficult. It's not challenging or replacing bad thoughts. CBT practitioners have been guilty of using this language, and then everyone gets confused. You can't just open your mind and put a good thought in where a bad thought is and everything's fixed. That's not how it works at all. It's not rational thinking. There is an element of that, but just because you get upset about something doesn't mean that you're being irrational. And humans aren't rational beings. It's just not how our mind works. So you can kind of use rational thinking, but it's not that. It's not affirmations. Telling yourself that you are happy and well in the mirror every morning isn't going to fix all of your problems, unfortunately. And it's not none of the rest of the stuff that you see on Instagram. Particularly if you see a cat poster with psychology says at the beginning, that's usually just a good indication that that's not actually what psychology says at all. So this is what CBT actually is. It's based on knowledge about how the brain produces three things, and these are the three things that psychologists study: thoughts, emotions, and behavior. And really the goal of cognitive behavioral therapies is really to help you develop psychological flexibility. And this means you can have three things in your mental life: awareness, so you're aware of what your mind is and what it does; acceptance, and I know people get a bit prickly when I talk about acceptance, so we'll go into what I mean by that, but really it means being able to have your mind rather than being your mind. And then agency, having some choice in your mental life as well. So when things do get difficult upstairs, you're able to take a step back and have a little bit more room. And we're focused on anxiety today because I know that that's a problem for a lot of people at the moment. And this here at the bottom is kind of the big goal of cognitive behavior therapy, is helping fear become more an uninvited guest than an unelected dictator in our heads. So let's get started with awareness and acceptance, or, welcome to your mind. This is something that, philosophers have been talking about for millennia, right? What is our mind? We've all got this chatterbox thing in our head, and sometimes it's really useful and other times it's really not so useful. So in technical terms, it is a symbol-based predictive modeling and meaning-making machine. But you all knew that, of course. In human terms, what that means is we think in symbols. So we use things like language, we use images, all of those sorts of things. Your mind is there to predict things. What's coming up? It is a key question for your mind. It needs to know what's going to happen next. And then making sense of what happens to you. And it's got a few favorite pastimes, and hopefully some of these should be pretty familiar if you've been living with your mind as long as I've been living with mine. Categorizing, putting things into categories, absolutely loves it. And we use labeling to sort of really supercharge this. You probably come across this in your own life. So when someone applies a label to you, they treat you in a certain way. The brain loves to do this, it does it automatically. Comparing, is something better than, worse than, faster than, slower than, more expensive than? You do it automatically. Judging, I'm not sure about everyone listening, but this is a particular favorite of my mind. Is something good? Is something bad? And expecting, and this expecting bit is so critical to anxiety, because often our expectations cause us a lot of anxiety. Unrealistic expectations, worrying about not meeting our own expectations, or worrying about not meeting the expectations of others can be a real source of anxiety. So I thought I'd focus on that. There are a lot of ways it some people, this is a big thing in terms of, what they should be doing or what other people should be doing. And then the world, what should happen when we leave the door? How should the world be? And some of us can get very caught up in this at the moment, particularly these bottom two, right? I'm down here in Melbourne, a lot of expectations about other people's behavior. Where should you be going? How close should you be sitting to me? Should you be wearing a mask? Should you be, patting that dog? So a key goal of cognitive behavior therapy is kind of unpacking these, because your expectations influence the way you see yourself, other people, the way you think and feel in everyday life. And so we generally sort of start off with this kind of thing in our head. What should I be doing? What should other people be doing? We kind of do this over time. We start to think, what should I be? And what should other people be? And this is a much trickier proposition, because this is who we are. And if we're not enough or others aren't enough, it can be a real source of anxiety and shame for people. So as we go along, I want you to think about this question, or even later in the day, ask yourself this question: how much anxiety and stress in your life comes from unrealistic expectations that you might have of yourself or from other people? And I'm sure some of you might be already thinking this, but expectations in the workplace can be really, really difficult to navigate, particularly when they're unrealistic. So let's start to unpack it. How do we create expectations? There are two sort of key building blocks, and once we understand these, we can kind of use these to change the way we think and feel. We learn experientially through our experiences. So you've probably heard the phrase, we are the sum of our experiences. It's really true in some ways. Our experiences kind of solidify over time into these concepts about how we, others, and the world should be. And then also we develop our expectations from the meaning that we make as well. It'd be lovely if we experienced the world and saw reality really clearly, and then develop these very clear expectations about reality. But this meaning-making part of us just really gets involved. And so we learn by thinking and making sense. We decide that something that happens means something. So this is kind of a complex summary statement, very typical of an academic psychologist, but we'll work through it. Your mind automatically builds these conceptual frameworks, and they really influence the way you think and feel and act. But you're not actually your mind. And this comes as a bit of a shock. It's even working with clients clinically sometimes, it comes as a shock to them that those thoughts, that chatterbox in the head, that's not actually them. That's something you can look at, it's something you can work with, you can choose, you can have choice, you can have agency. But you're not your mind, you're not your concepts. And here's the challenge, and here's a big goal of modern cognitive behavior therapies, is can you give your mind permission to be what it is? Can you let it compare and judge and analyze and criticize and expect? And knowing that it's going to do that, then just get on with your life. Pick and choose the bits of your mind that you find useful and move on from the stuff that might not be that useful. And this is where agency comes in, and this is my favorite bit, is we can develop strategies to have some choice in our mental life. So let's start with dismantling and recalibrating our expectations. And this is where we can use that knowledge. We can use those building blocks of expectations to change our expectations and then change the way we think and feel. You can ask yourself this one question: what am I insisting upon from myself, others, and the world? And if you're feeling really stuck, if you're feeling really anxious, angry, resentful, if things aren't going well, asking yourself this question can just sort of open the door a little bit, pull the curtain back on those expectations. What experiences, so this can be people, places, stories, society itself, relationships, what's taught you to expect this? And when you reflect, you've probably been really explicitly taught that this is true about the world or yourself, that you have to perform at a certain level, that others should always be fair and reliable, you know, that you should be able to rely on things in society in a certain way. And what meaning have you made? What have you learned about yourself, others, and the world during those experiences? And then recalibrating, and there's a lot on this slide, so we'll just go through it step by step. The next question you can ask yourself is, what's the most realistic and generous expectation that you could have? And this is tricky. And you know, when we do CBT, this can take a long time, but it can be done independently if you ask yourself this question. And it's hard, particularly when you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling frustrated or angry. It can be really difficult to be generous to yourself and other people, particularly if you're not meeting your own expectations, if you're worried about falling short of someone else's, or the other situation where someone's not meeting your own expectations, and that's causing you a lot of anxiety and frustration. But we can kind of give it a go. We try on new expectations and see how they fit by creating these experiments and acting as if. So if you were to adopt this new expectation, if you were to change your expectation of your colleagues, your team, or if you're anything like me, yourself, if you were to expect a little bit less, not expecting, you know, not allowing yourself to become, you know, lazy or incompetent or not living up to what you want to do, but getting those expectations in line with reality, what would you do differently? Would you allow yourself more time? Would you ask more questions? Would you seek out some supervision? Or would you, you know, give yourself a few more resources? Do it, try it on, and then see what happens. This is the experiential learning that we were talking about at work. Your brain is ready to update your expectations, unpack what you learned about yourself, about other people in the world by trying something new and seeing what happens. So that's one way you can recalibrate your expectations. And thinking about this is actually something that you can do as a team as well. If you're feeling a certain level of anxiety in your team, if you're, you know, if there's absenteeism, presenteeism, if things are really tough, you know, if you're in a leadership role or a management role, you can do this. You can recalibrate your expectations and start to build a culture at work of discussing those. What are our expectations? And ask your team this question: what's the most realistic and generous expectation that we could have here? And give it a go. So that's recalibrating expectations. Let's think of it. There might be times where you don't have time, you don't really want to do that, or maybe that's just not your thing. Some people are really curious about their minds, others just want to get on with life. So let's think about a quick fun strategy that you could use if you just really need to move on in the moment. And this is what we call diffusion. It's kind of this made up word. But what we do is we really get fused with our mind. We really see it as who we are, not a tool that we have or something that we have in our head that helps us in some ways. So what we want to do is we want to defuse, basically. We want to take a step back. So just to recap, remember that your mind is designed to piece together meaning to make sense of what's happening. So it can make really rapid predictions about what's happening in your world right now. And really, your mind's motto is speed over accuracy. I'm not sure if you've noticed this yourself, but if you really think about it, it's your mind really rapidly pieces together this story about what's happening and what it all means. And it does it really quickly. It's not really that interested in facts. It's much more BuzzFeed than it is New York Times. It kind of sells itself as this very in-depth investigative reporter, but actually it's much more clickbait than that. And it specializes in those things, right? Judgment, comparison, categorization, and those are probably really useful sometimes, particularly when you're analyzing a difficult situation, making important decisions. But when you start judging, comparing, or categorizing yourself, it can cause a lot of anxiety. What if you aren't enough? What if you aren't enough by comparison? What if someone has applied this sort of category to you? Difficult, a loser, you know, unemployable, whatever the label is. So it can seem bad and scary and awful, and sometimes it feels like we're trapped in our heads with this person, right? It's actually amazing as long as you don't leave it in charge, and this is the key bit, stop leaving it in charge. And we can do this by diffusing, by stepping back. So the strategy that I'm going to suggest is kind of a simple one, but it can be kind of effective, is naming your mind. It helps you notice it. It helps you see it as part of the picture. It's part of the suite of tools that you've got, but it's not you. You can choose to listen to it. You can control the conversation. So when you select a name for your mind, I'll share with you mine in a moment, it should honor how helpful it is. The goal is not to criticize or demonize your mind. You don't want to be stuck in your mind with this horrible person. You can kind of make it fun. So here's my mind. This is Gerald. I'm not sure if there are many Pixar fans here today, but this is Gerald from Finding Dory. Gerald is very earnest. He's very helpful. He's got a pail that's occasionally of use. And really what he wants to do is help. But I mean, I don't know about you, but this is not the face I want in charge of my mind and my life. This is not the face of authority for me. So let's think about how we might assign some of these mental stories to Gerald rather than seeing them as facts. So here's an example, may or may not have been taken from my own life, you know, not necessarily owning this, but my boss hasn't replied to my email. That look she gave me in the meeting was a sign that my next performance review isn't going to go badly. I'm probably going to get taken off this project and transferred like they did with Jason. I'm basically the new Jason. Apologies to any Jasons in the audience. I'm sure you're amazing at your job. But what we can do here is just add a few words and immediately see it differently as a meaning-making story that our brain is coming up with rather than a fact. So my boss hasn't replied to my email, and according to Gerald, that look she gave me in the meeting is really a sign that my review is going to go badly, and blah, 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 blah. Every time, when you notice these meaning-making stories, write it down and then add according to, and then insert your mind's name in there. And immediately you can kind of see that really it's probably not an authoritative text, right? This is probably not the face that you want to be, you know, not the face of authority here. This is just your mind offering you a suggestion. It's offering you a meaning-making story. You needn't accept it. Gerald is offering you his pail. You don't have to accept it. And really, this is the goal. And this kind of looks like that kind of Instagram BS that I was talking about at the beginning, but it's really based on how we understand changing your relationship with your mind can benefit you. And you can take a step back from those meaning-making stories, that part of your mind that's just going to do what it does. You can start actually living your life. You can make different choices. You're not stuck in this tug of war with Gerald over what's good or bad or right or wrong or what label should apply. You can ask a few more questions and you can make some decisions from a different place. So we've been through a lot. Let's just sum up what we've been through and break it down into its key elements. So the goal of cognitive behavior therapies is to help you develop awareness, acceptance, and agency. Awareness and acceptance means that knowing your mind will incessantly categorize, compare, label, judge, and expect. It's just going to do this. And when we say acceptance, you don't have to like it, you don't have to condone it, and you don't have to give up. But acceptance means to take something as it is, and the invitation here is to take your mind as it is. Let it do its thing, don't leave it in charge. And the agency bit, you've got two new skills that you can start to build. They're not something that you build overnight, they're a practice, but you can dismantle your expectations and try on some new ones. See if they fit. Try doing something differently. Change your expectations of yourself and others and see what happens. Or you can defuse. So you can defuse from your mind by labeling your mind, recognizing that its input is just a first attempt at meaning making. It's doing its best, but it's probably not that accurate. Thanks, Gerald, but I need to know more or I need to do more in order to live the life I want to live. And I'll leave you with a couple of suggested readings. If you want to get to know Gerald, this is the book. This is like the guide to Gerald. Is A Liberated Mind by Stephen Hayes, who developed one of the modern approaches to cognitive behavior therapy, which is called acceptance and commitment therapy. And if you're the sort of person like me who struggles with expectations, has unrealistic expectations of yourself, worries about not meeting the expectations of others, Brené Brown is your girl. This book, The Gifts of Imperfection, is all about the fact that we are imperfect. We will fall short of other people's expectations and our own. But doing that deliberately can actually enrich our lives in some pretty unexpected ways. So that's my presentation. Hopefully that was interesting, and hopefully you know a little bit more about how cognitive behavior therapy can help you manage anxiety and stress.
Thanks, Peter. You know, I was just sort of reflecting on what you're talking about, and I had no plans on talking about this, but I think, you know, these conversations become a lot more interesting when you apply a bit of personal story to it. But I remember years ago I started my own business, and I had this sort of anxiety around failure. You know, I was going to go broke, I was going to lose my contacts, you know, and that's when I started doing some CBT work with you know, with a psychologist. It was part of my business plan. These techniques that we've just, you know, covered in 15 minutes, you know, they're incredibly simple, but it does take time to really get a, you know, handle on. Now, what's your advice to people who, one, are intrigued, thinking about, you know, learning more about it, and then I guess secondly, at an organisational level, you know, can you implement some of these things at an organisational level?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that your business plan had talking to a psychologist as part of your plan. That's, I mean, that's a great example of how you could do it at an organizational level, right? No matter the size of the organization. I mean, as I said, these are things that take time to learn. There's no quick fix, unfortunately, usually with mental health. Often when people start, you know, experiencing problems with anxiety and depression, the problem built up for a really long time, and there's not going to be, it's going to take time to sort of change the trajectory. But I think reading some books like the ones that I've recommended can be a really great start, particularly if you've got that sort of that spark of curiosity there and you want to know more. Taking some time to read books and think about, you know, what strategies might work for me, what might not. Working with a psychologist obviously is going to be really useful to do that. But I think at an organizational level, when I work with organizations, I try and focus on that, building a culture of knowing what your expectations are and making it safe to talk about them. Often it's not necessarily safe to say, I can't or we can't, but that for a leader or a manager really should be the warning sign that expectations really are unrealistic. And it's hard when you've got deadlines and you've got deliverables to recalibrate your expectations. But if you can build a culture where people can come to you and say, I can't, or I can't now, or I can't in this way, and you can show them that it's safe for them to say, first of all, and this is the tricky bit for a lot of managers, is to be willing to hear it. Be really willing to hear that your staff are struggling and the goals that you've put in place and the expectations from a project point of view, from a culture point of view, are causing anxiety and stress. If you can do those two, the more you show that you're willing to, the more people will find it safe to do that. And you'll build this culture of being able to sit down and recalibrate your expectations.
Mm. And I love challenging fear, because I've got this saying with people that know me well, in that it hasn't happened. So, this whole concept of being really anxious about something that could happen when it hasn't happened, and that's a lot of the stuff that you're talking about. So, we could talk about this for hours, and so I hope people who've dialed in have got something out of it, which is practical. In some of the concepts you've spoken about, there's elements of mindfulness. So we'll get Michael Bunting, on the line now. So some of the stuff that Peter was talking about, there was elements of mindfulness, stepping back from your mind, being aware of what's going on, and accepting with compassion some of the thoughts and feelings. Michael, I'm keen to hear a little bit more about mindfulness, and how is this all relevant to what we're talking about?
Thank you, Mario, and good morning, everybody. So we're going to try and keep this presentation to a max of 15 minutes and quite a few concepts to cover. And I really love Peter's presentation. And one of the fundamentals of Peter's presentation is that you have a degree of awareness to even see Gerald in operation. And that awareness of being able to see Gerald in operation is a mindfulness action or a mindfulness practice, and it's natural to us. Mindfulness is a very natural thing, but it can also be cultivated, and it's the cultivation of mindfulness that creates enormous benefits. So let's go through some simple logics here. So the first thing to know is that mental health is mostly an inside job, right? Or happiness is an inside job. And we often quote the study from Sean Acor, which basically is a 12-year study, comprehensive study, that tells us that 10% of our long-term happiness is dependent on what's going on around us. So our conditions, whether we're in COVID or not COVID. Obviously, there's short-term spikes in difficulty, but long-term, it's much more about how you're processing the world, how you're thinking, how you're managing your mind. And again, you saw wonderfully in Peter's presentation how relevant you are working with your mind is on your well-being. But it's far more significant than most of us think. And if you actually consider your difficulties or your challenges and the solution to those challenges, you'll probably find it's extremely rare that you consider a solution to your problems, your thinking or your way of paying attention. We're mostly fixated on getting that 10% of our lives right in the hope that the rest will be well, but it's not actually accurate in a way. It's not a wise action. So what is the difficulty here? And in mindfulness, we talk about, when we say how the brain processes the world, in the mindfulness work, we translate that as how you are managing your attention. So it's the one thing you have absolute choice over, is how you manage your attention and what you give your attention to. And mindfulness is cultivating the ability to wisely manage that attention. So let's quickly look at how we mismanage our attention. Then there's three broad categories of mismanagement of attention. The first one is multitasking. So some of you may already be checking emails as you're listening to this webinar. You're trying to sort of squeeze this webinar in and do something else. If you're doing that, your attention's starting to get split and it starts dancing, and it's really not good for you long-term. It's not good for your mental health, but it also dramatically reduces your intelligence. So multitasking is a mismanagement of your attention, and most of us are doing it all day long. Another aspect of that's technology addiction in all of its forms, whether that be social media or that's just, emails first thing in the morning or last thing at night, and we're using technology as a means to self-medicate. That's a mismanagement of our attention. And the last is a brain science term called the default network. And that's really Gerald in a way, again, using Peter's language, where the mind is kind of, it's law unto itself, and it's up to a myriad of things. But what it's not doing is it's not clear and present in here. It's distracted with the past and the future. It's judging, categorizing. It's doing all of these things in sort of in a drift-like state. That's also a very big area of attention mismanagement. It's also a lifelong journey of understanding how the mind works. But mindfulness is kind of the prerequisite, if you will. It's the core engine that allows us to begin to develop insight and wisdom into ourselves. We know that attention deficit is increasingly worse. This is 2006 research, but attention deficit, which is multitasking, and tech addiction leads to black-white thinking. It makes staying organized difficult, and it leads to a low-grade level of panic and guilt. And most people experiencing that level of panic and guilt. And as Satya Nadella says, we are moving from a world where computing power was scarce to a place where it's now almost limitless, and where the true scarce commodity is increasingly human attention. And this is a study done by Microsoft on human attention. And you can see in humans, on average in the year 2000s, attention span was 12 seconds. That's how long you can stay, how on average long you can stay present. Like right now, how long can you stay present listening to this webinar? And you'll find that the mind's very wanting, it's very attracted to drifting off and multitasking. You'll notice it in yourself right now. So with all of this technology, etc., the attention span dropped from 2000 to 2013 to 8 seconds, and a goldfish's attention span's 9 seconds. So, and you can imagine, even it's decreased even more from 2013. This study hasn't been repeated, but we're now in an attention deficit society, and that attention deficit plus an uneducated attention is a recipe for disaster on our mental health. The default network itself also is associated with all kinds of nasty side effects. So early indications are that it has implications for Alzheimer's and dementia. These two brain scans here, the one on the bottom is an Alzheimer's brain, and the one on the top is your brain while you're distracted and thinking and idle and recalling daydreams. So you kind of, you're bringing on, it's like not exercising has consequences on the body over time. Drifting in thought all day long and categorizing, etc., has consequences on your brain health as well as your mental health over time. In fact, interesting research showing that it ages you basically. So this is research that's come out of Elizabeth Blackburn, who won the Nobel Prize for discovering telomeres. And it's really interesting that the greater level of mind wandering, the greater the level of telomere shortening. And her research on telomeres, and I'm not a medical expert, but basically, as it's a cap on the end of the chromosome related to the DNA. As you age, the telomere becomes shorter and shorter. So interestingly enough, the more your mind wanders, the shorter your telomere comes. So if you're really interested in premature aging or speeding up the aging process, not addressing your mind or not managing your attention, and with all of the attention addiction around us, you're going to end up in a whole heap of trouble around premature aging and ongoing anxiety and stress. So it's not really like, it's like if you don't exercise, there's going to be consequences. Nowadays, if you don't manage your attention, there's going to be consequences, because the alternative is like the default, and the default's not healthy for you. This is what the research is discovering. So mindfulness has a lot of great promise in addressing this, and it's really interesting how much it's been researched. So there were only 155 papers on mindfulness published in scientific journals in the year 2000. At 19 years later, we're at 2,379 were published last year. So it's an extremely well-researched area and growing rapidly. What is mindfulness? So I've already said it's attention management. It sounds dull and boring, but actually mindfulness is fascinating as a subject. It's at one level very simple. At another level, for me, this is year 27 of a dedicated mindfulness practice, and I still feel like a beginner, and it's very fresh and intricate and fascinating, because you're revealing your mind to you, and the mind is quite fascinating in its own way, troublesome and beautiful. So what is mindfulness technically? It's about maintaining awareness. So if we look at attention deficit, mindfulness is the opposite. It's about extending attention, right? So how do we do that? We bring ourselves into the present moment and we try and stay there. And that is very difficult for most of us because our minds have become constantly distracted. That leads to a profound lack of self-awareness, but also an ongoing anxiety, and anxiety just becomes the norm as the mind dances around. So we're trying to maintain presence and steady the mind. It's the beginning. This awareness that grows can be applied internally as well as externally. So what do we mean by that is we can bring this quality, this trained quality of awareness into our minds, and we begin to see Gerald in operation, for example, more accurately. We can begin to insight and question what's going on internally. We can become skillful at working with our emotional world. We can even identify our emotions more clearly. We can begin to notice that if we feed the emotions with stories, they stick around and they lead to poor action or unhelpful action that leads to our own and other suffering. We can start beginning to know what's happening in ourselves physically and know the markers, for example, when we're not following our values, what that feels like physically. So which is not available to you if you are in that default network and you're tuned out with all the other attention mismanagement processes. So the research shows that it leads to dramatic improvements in self-awareness, self-regulation, mental health, emotional intelligence, physical health, and performance. So when I say also you can apply it externally, one of the interesting examples we use is a lot of children are now experiencing what's called proximate abandonment. Their parents are in the home with them, but the children are experiencing emotional or attentional abandonment because the parents are just not there. They're on their phones, they're distracted, they're thinking about work, and the child's not getting the connection they need right in front of the parents. So just to those of you who are parents listening to this, take a good look at this in yourself the next couple of days. What's the quality of attention even with your children or your spouse? And how long can you sustain attention if it becomes uncomfortable? So if your child is upset or suffering or tantruming, what happens to your attention? Does it split? Do you get intolerant? Can you manage yourself better? Which leads to the second subject, which is self-awareness, which is what we spent most of our last decade teaching leaders, self-awareness. And it's really interesting because if you ask someone to be self-aware as a practice, in our experience, maybe 1 in 10,000 people can even answer that question of, how do I be self-aware right now? Like, do it, be self-aware. And it's like, well, I don't know, think, try and see my impact on others. And unfortunately, none of those are self-awareness. So there's this massive gap in self-awareness training, because again, if 1 in 10,000 senior leaders, we work with leaders all around the world, can only 1 in 10,000 can answer the question, I know how to be self-aware right now as a practice, it shows you the gap. And mindfulness is the technique process, and there's a whole range of practices to develop very, very advanced levels of self-awareness, which also is related to adult maturity and adult growth. So the more mature you are as a human being, the more you can see what's going on in you and not be ruled. That is a fundamental mindfulness practice that does that. It does that action of helping you see and then not be ruled by things internally. We also know that there's interesting brain evidence or brain science evidence that the mindfulness creates much more happiness and wellness. Here's one of many examples. The precuneus, apparently people are happy, the precuneus is thicker. Turns out that when you do 6-week mindfulness program, the precuneus, that part of the brain grows. It also builds self-regulation or self-awareness. So when people practice mindfulness over time, the amygdala shrinks and the prefrontal cortex grows in the brain. The prefrontal cortex is associated with executive function or self-regulation or self-awareness. And we all know this, where we can kind of split off and be crazy for a minute. We lose our temper, and then sort of 20 seconds later or a minute later, we can look and go, what was I doing? Basically, that's you're going with the amygdala, and then you calm down and the prefrontal cortex comes online. And mindfulness allows us to operate from that prefrontal cortex a lot more, which creates much more connection in our lives and also much more wise decision making. So as I get towards the summary of this very quick presentation, so we're going from attention deficit, we're an attention deficit culture nowadays, into attention regulation. So instead of multitasking and tech addiction and this endless default network, and we haven't got into the details of the default network, which is a big subject, but basically not being present, drifting into the past and future all the time, constantly comparing, judging, sort of sits in that broad absent-mindedness category. We're going from that to knowing where your attention is. So being able to question, where's my attention now? Then prioritize where it needs to be. That gets better and better over time as you develop more and more understanding and wisdom around your mind through various mindfulness practices. And then being able to maintain your attention on where it most serves you. That's a mindfulness practice. We asked the question, advanced mindfulness teachers, typically it's probably 20 years of practice and work. So it's a very, very subtle, broad, big subject, mindfulness. It's at one level very simple, very practical and doable, and at another level extremely, extremely advanced. And we asked the question, is it possible to introduce mindfulness at scale? Because there's not too many amazing mindfulness teachers running around. There's a lot of people who've done a weekend certification course. But can you scale mindfulness, at least in its basic format, into organizations? And we designed a very comprehensive app. We began the design of this app 3 years ago, and it contains a whole bunch of programs and meditation practices. And think of meditation practices as training the mind in various skills of managing physical sensations, emotional, being able to see the mind, being able to manage our attention more effectively in the workplace, and so on and so on. And we developed this app, and then we developed a what we call a team starter program, where we gave an internal person in an organization a facilitator guide and an 8-week program on basically sits on the app. And then they have these, it's a hybrid learning model where the team, say a team of 12 people, go through this program together. One person facilitates meetings every 2 weeks, and they do some self-paced learning content, completely independent of us. So the experiment was, can you scale mindfulness through an organization in a healthy way that actually delivers really good benefits to mental health in the organization? And we were lucky enough to have the University of Singapore, one of the most prestigious universities in the world, research several organizations using this app. And here's what we found. We found that on average, and the most important figure in today's result, because there's many important numbers here on the bottom, you'll see that 11% mindful attention increased 11%, flow, work engagement, which is phenomenal, on people's engagement at work increased 7% over 8 weeks. But the most important number here in today is the minus 23%. So emotional exhaustion, which is a very important signifier of mental health. Over an 8-week period, people's emotional exhaustion reduced 23% or improved 23%, which is very significant without any expert intervention. So we now know that mindfulness is actually scalable in organizations at a low cost. And with that, I'm going to conclude and hand back to you, Mario.
Thanks, Michael. I'm feeling almost a little bit deflated. Now, I've been doing this work for many, many years, but when you talk about multitasking and being absent at home as a parent, you kind of think, by now I should have got that one right. But it's incredible how we get pulled into, how I've been pulled into things. In particular, the last 6 months, I live in Melbourne, for those who don't know me, and I just get pulled into just responding to phone calls, emails, and just so many things. And you get to the end of the day and you're emotionally exhausted. And then I actually need a couple of hours at the end of every day to just to chill out. But in doing that, I'm actually absent from everything else that's going at home. So, one of the things I like about working with you, I always walk away just being reminded of something, or learning something new.
So Mario,
I guess.
I'd just like to, sorry to interrupt, but I love the term you said, chilled out. So almost I want to chill out. And a word for mindfulness is chilled in. So it's like, instead of tuning out, I tune in. So this is a part of a mindfulness practice. So when I'm chilled in instead of chilled out. Does that make sense? But effectively, mindfulness is a profound paradox, because at one level, it's training us to be more present, which a lot of us want to avoid because we're challenged by what's happening. But the more present we are, the more resourced we are, the more well we are. And it's kind of a virtuous circle.
I mean, it's interesting we're talking about mindfulness, because I like to meditate, but I've spoken to a lot of friends, in particular lately, and I've spoken to a couple of people that have said, and usually they're blokes, I gave it a go, but I didn't get there. I didn't reach that point, and then I sort of asked them a question. Well, what do you mean you didn't get there? So what's your feedback to people who are starting out? And then how do you sort of sustain it in a way that it's no different to learning how to, run? You've got to start somewhere and eventually get better at it. What's the best way of sustaining that growth?
So the first thing to say is that mindfulness is not, meditation is an aspect of mindfulness, but mindfulness itself is about being extended time in the present, right? And being able to apply that internally, externally. Meditation is a very important practice because it's like going to the gym for mindfulness. It's a very discrete practice. And you also, because you're not distracted by anything else in your world, you can begin to really see what's going on internally. For many people, as they begin that process, what's going on internally is you've been cultivating a quote unquote a mess inside. Therefore, however old you are, maybe there's even underlying trauma or unresolved issues, and sitting still with yourself is a profoundly uncomfortable experience. And then what the mind defaults to is, this is uncomfortable, where's the comfort? Which that is that short-term fixation that's covered beautifully, interesting enough, in the ACT, in Stephen Hayes's work, Acceptance Commitment Therapy, that the mind always wants short-term, it wants short-term immediate relief from pain and pleasure. And mindfulness is effectively reversing that process. So I would say to people who begin to meditate, it's like you need to really expect discomfort, and a lot of it. And it does take discipline. So it's really important to ask the question, why you're doing it. I'm lucky in that most of the time we're working with corporate clients, it's people who need to develop self-awareness, and there's an imperative. So there's a certain amount of motivation. But if you come to the conclusion that if you ask yourself a simple question, what if I cultivate this, whatever this is, for the next 10 years, where does this take me? And what if I'm cultivating a busy mind all the time, where does that take me? Is a quite sobering question. The thing with beginning to practice mindfulness is either that people will sell it as like a drug. It's like, hey man, it's all going to, you'll zen out, and then you immediately experience failure. So first thing to say, it can be very challenging and is challenging. Second thing to say is, if you really want to get benefits out of it, don't even think about what it's doing to you for at least 8 weeks. So practice daily, 5-10 minutes. And I forgot to mention to everyone that we are making our app available, the premium app available to everyone on this webinar. You'll be getting an email from the Aon team that will say, here you go, and you could go in and explore and do the introduction course that tells you exactly how to practice it. But it's kind of it's about maturity. It's expecting difficulty, and in even sometimes celebrating difficulty. It's like, if you could sit down for say 5 minutes and meditate, and the whole experience is challenging, but you still sat there, you're reversing a fragile mind. Like the mind is constantly running from discomfort. To be able to stay in discomfort for 5 minutes is an extremely important mental health practice. And also critically, it's super, super, super important for managing our own difficult feelings. Because if we keep running from our difficult feelings, we're constantly in an addiction pattern. So it's kind of changing so if someone says it doesn't work for me and I found it uncomfortable, my typical response is, that's awesome. And they're like, oh, what do you mean that's awesome? You're developing a degree of understanding of how to sit and be patient with your own emotional and mental world. How do you think it's ever going to improve? If 90% of your happiness is dependent on that world, wouldn't you want to begin to befriend that world, get to know that world, get to know how to navigate that world, and know it's not going to be comfortable? You might have beautiful moments of peace, but there's going to be a lot of challenge. But you will learn with the practices how to navigate those skillfully, which is a priceless lifelong skill.
So there's a couple of things there. One is you need to practice. Well, before that, you need to commit to it. You need to practice. You need to have the tools. So I think having access to the app, I think, is helpful. And then just really persisting.
Yeah, we have a weird quick fix culture now where who in their right mind goes for one jog and says to the person who taught them how to run, well, I don't feel great after that jog, this thing doesn't work. We all know it takes time. We all know there's physical discomfort. And so mindfulness is exactly that. It's training. And it's got all those exactly the same things. It's identical to exercise. And as we all know, sometimes we stop exercising and then we pick it up again. And we know when we don't, we fall, it has certain effects, and when we do. So if those of you listening have fallen off the mindfulness train, you can always get back on, just like exercise.
I was just having a bit of a laugh in my own head because the other day I was trying to do some meditation in the morning. I usually do it at night. And my older son comes into the study and says, hey, Dad, what are you doing? Oh, are you meditating? Oh, how's it going? I was like, yeah, fantastic. Great. Thanks, mate. So, I think one of the things I'm trying to do with my kids is to socialize the whole concept of, well, with me, I meditate, and just to make it a little bit more acceptable. When we think about mindfulness practices and or meditation into the workplace, because a lot of people that have dialed in today are coming at it obviously from their own personal interests, but also from the workplace. A lot of organisations that we work with from a mental health perspective is starting to do a lot of work around destigmatising the whole concept of mental health and talking about it, improving mental health literacy, improving the way leaders and managers respond and deal with it and how they have conversations around it, introducing the whole concept of self-care so people have certain skills to overcome certain feelings. From a mindfulness perspective, you know, what's the best way of, and you've already touched on this, but you know, for people that have dialed in today and have an interest in this and want to then take the next step around improving resilience, because that's what this is, you know, how does someone even introduce the concept? Because I would suggest a lot of people would be a little bit self-conscious about, you know, being the person in the executive meeting that says, you know, how about we introduce some mindfulness practices into the organization? I mean, what's the best way to go about it?
We have two contexts for that. I mean, the obvious one for us, the easiest one for us is leadership. So it's all the self-awareness practices. So we ask leaders, one of our favorite questions to ask executive leaders is, through all of your studies, and we're often dealing with extremely well-educated people, through all your studies, did anyone teach you how to manage your own mind? Did you ever learn that at university or school? And people are honest, no, they were never taught to manage their own mind. And is that not a significant skill for leadership, for emotional intelligence? Yes. Well, here's a suite of practices that will teach you to begin to manage your own mind in the best possible way. So in terms of self-awareness practice and leadership, that's obvious. But that applies also to the whole population. This is not, I wouldn't call this a, I'm stressed and mentally ill, here's my, because people that stigmatized. The way we introduce it is, this is a process for helping you grow as a human being and begin to develop a skill to manage your own internal world, your mind. And that is a priceless skill we wish to give you. And we've got several clients who've introduced our work to the whole organization. But then you have to have internal champions. And one of the other fascinating parts of our research is that there's a significant impact on leadership behavior on teams. So if you're an organization and you want to throw a mental health program at your people without looking at your leadership behavior, our research indicates that's not wise because it's seen as hypocritical. So it's quite a significant detail, if you will, that leaders are role modeling to some level healthy behaviors and allowing space. It's very, very important.
So you've really got to start there. Otherwise, it just comes across like another tick boxing exercise that someone wants to roll out a program and everyone attends it, tick a box, and you move on to the next initiative. It's got to be a lot broader than that, doesn't it?
Our advice to all organizations, because we specialize in behavior change and culture change as well, our advice to organizations is strip away 90% of your programs and do 10% of them well. This constant noise getting thrown at people with programs is also part of the problem, and it's also a part of a collective delusion that behavior change is only giving people information. It's not. Behavior change is a deep, elongated process that's supported by rituals, that's supported by role modeling, that's supported by quality practices, it's supported by support. So we always invite our clients to consider what are 1 or 2 or 3 really important behaviors that you want to address, and then put proper time and energy into those instead of the endless, because it ironically serves the multitasking, information addiction process, which does not serve our awareness. And without awareness, we're going to struggle to change behavior. In fact, it's impossible.
For anyone that's sort of done any work with me on the safety leadership stuff, the word insight comes up a lot. So a lot of what you're talking about is really about, if you don't have insight, then how do you progress? Because we all think we're over here, but often we're over there, or the way we see the world is different to how we see ourselves.
So we have a very, very simple process. We're doing information today, but information without insight is of zero value when it comes to behavior change, zero value. But interestingly enough, insights, while a prerequisite to behavior change, are relatively valueless as well. The most important part is sustained practice. So I can have an insight, oh my God, I'm the author of my own mental troubles. That I can have that realization that could be insightful. Oh my goodness, it's true. It's a visceral felt experience. But if I don't practice anything after that, the insights of little value.
So as we wrap things up, just I'd like to thank Michael and Peter for getting involved today. I think hopefully the viewers have enjoyed us talking about two things that I don't think we've been talking enough about at an organisational level from a mental health perspective. CBT is normally seen as something that only psychologists really talk about, and Peter's session really sort of touched on some really handy, useful skills that anyone can apply to themselves, but also in the workplace. There's a few references there for books if anyone's interested. Go and purchase one of those. And then, of course, with Michael, we just spent a good 20 minutes talking about mindfulness and the benefits of it. But you can see that it is something that requires time and investment in developing those skills. So I hope everyone enjoyed it. Please give us some feedback. If I'm lucky enough, I'll see if I can convince Michael to perhaps even come back and do another webinar purely on mindfulness, because it is such a more elaborate topic. So I'd like to thank everyone for dialing in. I know it's a Monday, it's Mental Health Week this week, so this is important in that context, but it is a fair commitment. So I appreciate everyone dialing in, and please give us some feedback, and hopefully we'll see you again in another webinar between now and Christmas. So thank you again, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.